For centuries, the Irish were a people under siege, raided, conquered, and exploited. By the early 1600s, some of them would be the first to arrive in the Americas, not as settlers, not as volunteers, but as slaves. History often teaches that slavery in the New World began with Africans. But the story of Irish slavery challenges that narrative. It is a history overlooked, minimized, or denied, and yet the evidence is clear. The Vikings and early Irish slavery. The story begins in the year 795. Viking longships strike the northern and eastern coasts of Ireland. These raids were swift, violent, and profitable. Villages burned, monasteries pillaged. Men, women, and children were captured. Many were ransomed, others were sold, taken to Scotland, Norway, and Iceland. By 837, the Vikings targeted larger monastic towns: Armagh, Glendalough, Kildare, Slane, Clonard, Clonmacnoise, and Lismore. These towns were centres of learning and wealth, making their inhabitants prime targets. In 841, the port that would become Dublin was seized. Olaf and Ivar the Boneless, legendary Viking leaders, turned it into a trading centre. Slaves became a major part of its economy. By 853, the slave market in Dublin was thriving, feeding a network that stretched across Europe. In 875, Irish slaves in Iceland rebelled, killing their master Jólafur Hrumason and fleeing to the Vestmannaeyjar Islands. It was Europe's largest slave rebellion since the fall of Rome. Resistance was ingrained in the Irish experience, even in captivity. By 980, under Mael Sechnaill MacDomnai, King of Meath, the Irish defeated the Vikings, freeing many slaves. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014, led by High King Brian Boru, would finally end Viking dominance, freeing remaining captives. Yet slavery itself, in other forms, would persist for centuries. The Normans and serfdom. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 brought seismic change to Ireland. Invited by Dermot MacMurrough, deposed King of Leinster, Norman forces landed in 1171 under Henry II of England. They abolished outright slavery in Ireland but maintained serfdom, a system binding people to the land. Serfs were not slaves in name, but their freedom was severely restricted. Selling people into slavery would leave no one to farm the land. The seeds of future exploitation, however, were sown. The term "going beyond the pale" originates from this period. The Pale was the only safe zone under Norman control. Beyond it lay danger, lawlessness, and oppression. Even as the Normans ended slavery, Ireland remained a land of vulnerability. Political instability, frequent wars between local kings, and foreign influence made ordinary Irish people easy targets for enslavement. English conquest and forced removal. By the early 1600s, Ireland was under immense pressure from England. The English crown sought not only political control, but also a labour force for its colonies. The defeat of the Irish-Spanish alliance at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 marked a turning point. The Irish aristocracy fled to Europe, leaving a power vacuum. Ordinary Irish people, already burdened by famine, war, and previous subjugation, found themselves vulnerable. English nobles and military leaders were quick to exploit this void. In 1603, King James I of England, newly crowned, issued the infamous Order of Banishment. This was not a simple policy of exile. It was effectively legalized enslavement. Irish men and women captured during the wars, political prisoners, and even undesirables, a category that included vagrants, beggars, and minor criminals, were now property to be sold or transported. By 1604, records indicate that groups of Irish prisoners were being sold to Portuguese traders and sent to South America, most likely the Amazon basin in modern-day Brazil. These were the first Irish people forcibly transported to the New World. It was not voluntary migration. entire families were torn apart. Children, often as young as 10, were separated from their parents and sent to labor in foreign lands. The scale of forced removal grew over the next decade. By 1612, tens of thousands of Irish men and women had been shipped across the Atlantic, many sold to English plantation owners in the Caribbean and North American colonies. The economic rationale was simple. African slaves were expensive, requiring £20 to £50 to purchase. Irish slaves, on the other hand, could be bartered for tobacco, indigo, or cotton, commodities that English traders controlled. In addition to economic motives, the English crown saw strategic value in the forced removal of the Irish. Removing rebellious populations reduced the threat of future uprisings at home. Deportation served a dual purpose. It generated profit and neutralized a potential military threat. The Irish were viewed as troublesome subjects, a constant concern for the English authorities. Some historians argue that the Irish were technically indentured servants, but the reality is starkly different. These individuals had no choice, no contract, no protection. They were forcibly uprooted, sold, and transported across the ocean, conditions that mirror what we recognize as slavery. By the 1620s, English authorities formalized these practices. King James I and later his son, Charles I, issued decrees authorizing the sale and transportation of Irish prisoners and civilians to the Americas. Tens of thousands more were shipped during this period. Records from Barbados and Virginia show Irish men, women, and children working side by side with African slaves, enduring grueling labor, harsh punishment, and complete loss of freedom. The human cost was staggering. Entire communities in Ireland were depopulated, families were fractured, a generation of Irish children was born into forced labor across the Atlantic. These policies would lay the foundation for centuries of English exploitation in Ireland and its colonies. The forced removal of the Irish during this period was not an isolated event. It was part of a systematic campaign of economic exploitation and social control, one that reshaped both Ireland and the emerging American colonies. It was brutal, calculated, and, for many, irreversible. Life in the Caribbean and North American colonies. When the Irish arrived in the Americas, they entered a world designed for profit, exploitation, and control. The earliest arrivals landed in Brazil, but soon English colonies, Virginia, Barbados, Montserrat, Antigua, and New England, became primary destinations. Tens of thousands of Irish men, women, and children were forced into labor, often alongside African slaves, enduring conditions that were brutal, dehumanizing, and deadly. In the Caribbean, Montserrat became an Irish stronghold. By 1637, nearly 69% of the population was Irish, largely forced laborers. Barbados, one of England's most profitable colonies, relied heavily on Irish slaves in its sugar fields. Even in North America, Irish captives were sent to Virginia, New England, and the Carolinas, performing the same grueling work expected of African slaves. The lines between indentured servant and slave were blurred, but context is key. Unlike indentured servants who sometimes migrated voluntarily under contracts, the Irish transported to the Americas were forcibly removed, sold, and controlled. Contracts did not exist in most cases, families had no say, and resistance often meant punishment or death. Children were particularly vulnerable. Records from 1656 show the English Council of State ordered the roundup of 1,000 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys, many as young as 10 to 14, to be sent to Jamaica and other Caribbean colonies. This was part of a larger campaign to supply labor for plantations, where work was unrelenting, planting, harvesting, and tending crops from dawn until dusk. The Irish were not just laborers, they were a source of profit and political control. English authorities feared rebellion. Whitehall documents explicitly warn of malignant and discontented Irish populations in the colonies, showing that Irish captives were considered dangerous enough to warrant military oversight. Even within this system, the Irish resisted in small ways. Rebellions, escape attempts, and cultural preservation through language, music, and religion were acts of defiance. Yet the trauma of forced removal, family separation, and harsh labor marked a generation. Their lives were defined not by freedom, but by survival under a system designed to exploit them completely. By the 1650s, Irish slaves were present from Barbados to Virginia, from Jamaica to New England, contributing to the early economies of English colonies in the Americas. Their labor helped establish plantation economies that would later expand with African slavery. But for decades, the Irish were at the forefront of forced labor in the New World. Cromwell and the Irish Holocaust. The most brutal period came under Oliver Cromwell. After defeating Charles I in the English Civil War, Cromwell invaded Ireland in 1649. Tens of thousands of Irish men were executed, while women and children were captured. Between 1650 and 1655, records indicate nearly 29,000 Irish were sold to planters in St. Kitts. Up to 100,000 Irish children, ages 10 to 14, were removed from their families and sold. Entire communities in Ireland were uprooted and sent to Caribbean plantations. Proclamation forced the Irish westward or to the colonies, with death as the penalty for resistance. His policy combined ruthless land confiscation with profit-driven human trafficking. The English elite feared rebellion. Documents from Whitehall explicitly discuss controlling the Irish population to prevent uprisings. By the mid-17th century, Irish slaves in the colonies often outnumbered European settlers. They labored alongside African slaves, contributing to the economy of the New World. The debate continues today. Were the Irish slaves or indentured servants? The distinction matters less than the facts. They were forcibly removed. They were bartered and sold. Families were separated. Children were captured and exploited. Even if contracts existed, they were signed under duress. Their lives were controlled. Their freedom was stolen. By the early 1700s, the African slave trade eclipsed the Irish in numbers. But for decades, the Irish were the primary forced labor source in English colonies, shaping the New World's early economy. Their story is a part of history too often overlooked. To explore more hidden chapters like this, click subscribe and stay informed.